Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. Jackie, I'm assuming that means you're ready for me, eh?
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay. It's a little bit different doing this without a live audience in front of me, but thank you to everyone who's giving up a little bit of their time this morning and this afternoon to speak with me. This is going to be a very brief, about an hour overview of just creating that initial climate for coaching. So this is going to be good for two very distinct groups of people, and hopefully you fall into one of those categories. The first is you are getting coaching rolling on your campus, or you're interested in getting coaching rolling on your campus, and you want to look at what concepts need to be included as part of that environment so that you can roll it out smoothly. The other group of you might be people who've had coaching on your campus in the past, or who have coaching now and have maybe run into some snags regarding the operation of coaching, and you want to figure out if there's some troubleshooting that we can do. So both of those groups, I think, are going to be very well served today through these three basic objectives. The very first thing that we're going to do is look at the role very clearly of both evaluative and non-evaluative coaches. What is the difference? How do you separate the two? How do you protect each other? Items like that are what we're going to cover in the first segment. The second segment is going to be about creating a clear target that builds consistency from classroom to classroom. Typically, when staff are interviewed or surveyed regarding any problems that are occurring on a campus, you will hear the word consistency come up, but we are actually inconsistent in how we define that very word. So we're going to talk about what consistency means and how we can also allow for autonomy, or the art of teaching, to be in place. And then the last segment is going to be about building a system of formative accountability on your campus. So if you want teachers and all staff to really strive to hit the target that's been created, how do you create a system so people know where they're at in relation to hitting that? And again, as Jackie said, please feel free to send questions in. If I think it would be good to insert your question within our discussion on the session objectives, I would be happy to do so. If not, we will go through them at the end, because again, in an hour-long session, it's going to be really difficult to hit every major point. This is almost like an infomercial on what coaching is. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at determining the role of an evaluative coach and the role of a non-evaluative coach. And actually, the very first thing that I recommend all campuses do is figure out who's even going to be available to coach your teachers. So let's do a global definition of what a coach is first, and just talk about what coaching means on your campus. There's a great author out there. Her name is Jane Kesey. She wrote a book called Differentiated Coaching, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention her. I had the opportunity to work with Ms. Kesey when I was an instructional coach back in Topeka, Kansas, quite a few years ago now, and she really believed that we had to get at the heart of who people are. We had to understand their personalities in order to coach them better. But what I really loved about her exploration of coaching was knowing that coaching has been present in most professional settings for decades. In most professional settings, businesses, having a coach work with you is actually a message that the business is sending you, and here's what people hear. Let's imagine for a moment we're sitting in our cubicle and we're at work on a project, and a coach comes into our cubicle and says, "Hey, I'm your friendly coach. The company has sent me to work with you." The message I would hear in the private sector is this: wow, I am so appreciated and valued by my company that they want to keep me around for as long as possible, and they believe I am an asset, and they want to hone my skills to make me as effective and efficient as possible so that I can work in this setting for as long as possible. That's the message that's heard. So I want you to take a moment, if you're by yourself, or especially if you're with a group, and you have coaching on your campus right now. In education settings, I want you to imagine you're a teacher, and a coach comes into your classroom and says, "Hi, the administrator has sent me to work with you." What is the message that is heard right now by teachers when a coach walks into their classroom? Take just a moment and think on that. And in fact, if you'd like to send me some comments through the question window, you can even do that. If coaching has been seen other than a mark of respect and value, that's going to be the first place where we know coaching has maybe taken a turn where we didn't want it to go. There's some advice that I give people, and of course you don't have to heed any of the advice I give you today on this webinar, but that is that we shouldn't be coaching people out of the profession. Now, sometimes through coaching, there are people who realize education might not be the place that they want to be, but that's not because we're forcing them out. We're not holding up a mirror to show people how bad they are and there's no hope. We're holding up a mirror to say, hey, this is our target. We really want to help you hit this. We value you as a human being. We value you as a professional. Let us give you as many resources as we can. If that's not currently the message that's being heard on the campus, that's something that you'll want to address. Now, the rest of what we cover in this session will go a ways towards addressing that. It's almost like a public relations incident that you may have gotten into, and we're going to address that through some of our next components. So the first thing we want to do then is define a coach who can walk into the classroom and assist teachers one-on-one. And I'm going to give you the biggest global definition, and then I'm going to give you some examples of who would be in each set. So anyone who interacts daily with teachers can be considered a prospective coach. So the first thing that I would do is make a list on your campus of anyone who interacts daily with teachers. Now, typically this is going to be your certified staff, so it would be things like counselors, school psychologists, anybody with the title of coach, obviously instructional coach, behavioral coach, but they might be called other things in your campus. But anyone who's been tasked with working one-on-one with teachers is prospective. And the biggest difference is evaluative or non-evaluative. And if you'll notice, the evaluative category typically has much less or fewer people in it than the non-evaluative category. Now, it's very important that people separate these two categories, because if all of your non-evaluative coaches are simply looked at as an arm of the administration, as people who have the potential to influence whether they are hired or fired, candor will take a hit in your coaching conversations. And if we can't be honest with each other through coaching, it's going to be very difficult for me to build a relationship where I can help move you forward. So you want to separate the two. So I'm going to give you a little, for those of you who have coaching right now, I'm going to give you a little experiment to do, and I recommend that you do so. If you are an evaluator, so any administrators who are on here and listening, I want you to think about any time you walk into the teacher's lounge and the lounge is crowded. Now, it doesn't matter how well loved and respected you are. When you walk into a crowded teacher's lounge, conversation probably drops off just a little bit. There's a momentary pause, at least, where people double check, are we talking about what we're supposed to be talking about? Is this what's best for schools, et cetera? There's a moment where conversation stops. And it should be that way, because you are seen as somewhat of an authority figure, and you do want people to be reminded, oh yes, there's a hierarchy in our school, and we want to make sure we're doing what's right for kids. Non-evaluators, so any of you who are instructional coaches, fellow teachers, standards chair, reading specialists, new teacher mentors, I want you to wait, and this week, when the teacher's lounge is crowded, I want you to walk in. And if conversation stops, you are being seen as an evaluator. And the more you are seen as an evaluator, the less likely people are to be really candid with you. Now, my recommendation is this. At the beginning of the year, sit down and figure who's responsible for what. I've even had teams sit down and make a Venn diagram with one side labeled evaluative and one side labeled non-evaluative, and you figure out what your responsibilities are. But at no time should a non-evaluative coach's role be to let an evaluator know what is happening in an individual classroom. The one caveat being illegal activities. Of course, we are all mandatory reporters, but outside of that, stylistically, data on opportunities to respond or ratio of interactions, things that we're getting into a little bit later, that is not for a non-evaluator to report to an evaluative coach. Now, I know many of you have systems set up that are, in fact, non-evaluators going in, gathering data, and reporting that data back to the evaluator. I recommend as much as possible you avoid that. So here's some different ways that you can do that. Non-evaluators, you can go in and take trend data, meaning you take data from a bunch of teachers and you report it as averages or highs and lows of the data counts and give that to an evaluator without it being attached to specific teacher names. Another way you can do it is evaluators, you can ask your teachers to collect data on themselves and report it back to you, and teachers may choose to ask the coach to gather that data for them. Those are two really, really good ways to do it. So non-evaluators simply serve as a conduit to gather the data that a teacher then gives the evaluator, or non-evaluators, you can report trend data back to the evaluators. And that's something that we spend a lot of time on when we do our extended training, what that looks like, but those are two major concepts that I wanted you to consider. Now, whether you are an evaluator or a non-evaluator, both groups, you are going to be responsible for leading change. So here's what I want you to do for just a minute, and this is going to be real short. I'm going to give you, probably about 60, 90 seconds to think about this. But I want you to personally think of a change that you've gone through that was successful and another that was unsuccessful. So maybe recently you've tried to lose weight and eat healthier. Maybe you quit smoking a few years ago, but you've started to try exercising recently and that hasn't been going well. But when you were successful at implementing a change, and for me personally, I can tell you there have been times I was successful at losing weight, but many more times where I was unsuccessful at losing weight. But what accounted for the difference? In other words, what made you succeed in some moments where in other moments you were not successful? So take just a moment. I want you to jot down a few notes. What do you need to make change work for you? You can also feel free to send me any of those notes as well. Okay, a minute may not seem like a long time for you, but in webinar land where I am sitting, that was like 3 years. So if you went through and jotted some things down, I'm going to share with you for me. I know if I want to be successful, there are two big ones that I am really influenced by. The first is I am very highly influenced by some level of loving accountability, meaning someone needs to be measuring me that not only do I respect and care about, but that it also might be a little uncomfortable for me to not hit the goal. I've tried to have friends hold me accountable, but that doesn't always work. I need somebody who has a little more teeth in it for me to be able to have enough skin in the game that I care about failure. The other thing I need is to not be a loner. If I try to do something by myself, I don't do well. I need a little crowd around me where we're all going through the same thing, we're all cheering each other on. So some level of a support group who's in the trenches with me and a level of accountability, those are two things that I really need. Now, if you're struggling to move an individual staff member forward, Coaches, whether you're evaluative or non-evaluative, I actually would encourage you to ask this question of any individual you're coaching, because if they tell you what I just told you, I need other people doing it with me, and I need some system of measurable accountability, I'm telling you what will be required for me to make any changes. And I'm also telling you, if that is not supplied for me, there's a strong probability that I will not put into practice some of the ideas that we are discussing. So we need to really pay attention to individualizing what teachers need to make change happen. If we believe in differentiated instruction, we have to at some level believe in what Jane Kesey talks about, differentiated coaching. Now, when we go to make change happen, let's talk about large-scale initiatives and where coaching fits into those. So a few years ago, we were in the middle of a project in a very large district in the United States, one of the top 5 largest districts, and we had all these trainings going on, and what I realized was people weren't coming to the right trainings. So we would be sitting there doing some trainings, and maybe we needed classroom teachers, but administrators were there. And then other times we would need administrators, but paraprofessionals might be sitting there. The right people weren't coming to the right places. So what I realized is anytime you want to launch a full-scale initiative, it's very important that you have 4 cornerstones at play. So let me walk through what those 4 cornerstones are. The 4 cornerstones, we're going to treat this like the foundation of any initiative. So in particular, what I'd like you to do, and I see there's many of you on here right now, is I want you to think right now of an initiative that is currently being put forth in your building. So it could be anything from it could be as global as Common Core. It could be as small as a new reading curriculum. It could be something like CHAMP's classroom management from Safe and Civil Schools. It could be restorative practices. It could be whatever you want to think of. And I'm going to ask you to figure out if these 4 cornerstones exist, and I'll give you some examples of those cornerstones. So the first cornerstone to build a strong foundation for whatever your initiative is you need your practitioners. So your practitioners are going to be anybody, and by the way, this will be available as a PDF, so you will be able to get all of my slides as a PDF file, and we'll clean them up and make them nice and neat for you. But your practitioner, those are going to be anybody that you are asking to put something into practice. So who's going to be on the ground doing the work? The next group is going to be your trainer. In other words, who's going to give the practitioners the information so that they can put it into practice. The third group is support. So these people may not necessarily be the trainers. These are the people that will aid practitioners in troubleshooting any problems that arise when you go to implement. And then the fourth cornerstone is accountability. These are the people making sure that the practitioners, the trainer, and the support people are all doing what they're supposed to be doing. And all 4 of those have to be present. And in fact, when we've seen initiatives fail, it's pretty easy to identify which one or more are missing. So let me give you some examples of what these 4 cornerstones might look like. Many of you are familiar with Safe and Civil Schools. Many of you are familiar with CHAMP's classroom management. So let me just go over what that might look like. If I'm sitting with my team of coaches, both evaluative and non-evaluative, and we're thinking about bringing CHAMP's classroom management into our school, we're going to sit down and figure out who fits into each one of these categories. So the first group of practitioners in our school is going to be, of course, the classroom teachers. They're going to be putting CHAMPs into practice. So who are we going to have train this? Well, for this example, we might bring in an outside consultant, maybe somebody from Safe and Civil Schools, maybe somebody from our own district that has attended the summer conference, but somebody's going to come in to give the training to the teachers. So who's going to be the support? Well, we might decide that the coaches are going to provide support, and most likely the non-evaluative coaches will be helping do the troubleshooting on the ground, but that could just as easily be other mentor teachers or leads within your school. And then the accountability is most likely going to be the administrators. The administrators are going to be walking around and making sure that the practitioners, or the teachers in this case, have put things into practice. So that's one example. Now, the thing about the cornerstones is it's very dependent on the initiative which cornerstone you fit into. So in CHAMP's, The support piece are, in fact, the coaches. But that might change if our initiative is that we're going to be bringing in coaching classroom management. So let's say we've decided that our coaches need additional help, and we're going to train them in safe and civil schools coaching classroom management. In this case, the coaches become the practitioners for this particular initiative. The trainer might again be a consultant. The support might be somebody who's in a director position, and I'm making some of these titles up as we go, but who's going to coach the coaches, basically. And then the accountability measure might be the coach's supervisor and or building level administrators. Sometimes those are the same people. Sometimes they're different. But the point is, every time we go to hit an initiative, we need to sit down and think about what who are in our 4 cornerstones. How are those going to be represented? Typically, when we go through this activity in a full 1 to 2 day training, I have people identify for their specific initiative which one is missing. So I want you to take just a moment, and I want you to think about the initiative I had you identify at the very beginning. If you were to just quickly jot down for the initiative you were thinking, whether that's a new reading curriculum, whether that's Common Core, whether that's CHAMPS, whether that's restorative practice, who fits into each of these categories? And then the next question is, do they know what they're doing in each category? Because it's one thing to say, hey, the consultant is going to train, but does the consultant know exactly what you want? Do the coaches know exactly what the outcomes are as practitioners in this last example, et cetera? So I want you to take just a minute again, and I want you to think about an initiative you've got ready to launch. Who would be in each category, and do they know what to do within each cornerstone? And feel free to keep commenting on the Q&A as well, and I can pick up some ideas from there. Take about 1 minute. If you are missing any of these cornerstones, I'd like to remind you of a great Thomas Edison quote that's out there. Vision without execution is hallucination. In other words, just imagining we're going to implement this program or this project or that project or this initiative or that initiative without actually thinking through who's going to put it into practice and where will all the support pieces fall. That is hallucination, and we've been doing it for a long time in education. I think we've decided we're going to solve everything via book study, and we're going to train people to death. And training, that is one cornerstone. That's not going to be what puts things into practice. So we really believe that coaching, both evaluative and non-evaluative, is the bridge between vision and execution. So in order to build this bridge, we're going to roll into our next segment, and that is, if we're going to get people to change, if we're going to put these cornerstones in place then, how do we create a target that builds consistency from classroom to classroom while allowing autonomy from teacher to teacher? Now, I do have some questions coming through as we move into this, and some people said, can support and accountability, can it be the same person? And absolutely it can be the same person, and especially in smaller schools, smaller districts, sometimes all you have is an evaluative coach. And in that case, it's very important that even as you're setting the target as an evaluator, that there are times where you let people know, today I'm your evaluator, or today I am creating formative accountability for you. And we'll get into the formative accountability here in just a little bit. But as any of you know who are out there and are probably trying to be both roles, it's very difficult to be both the support and the accountability because you kind of squish people in the middle. So if you can at all have additional support outside of the person who's evaluating the practitioners, I would highly recommend that. But as a person who's lending accountability, I would recommend that this next section be something you spend a particular amount of time on, and that is just creating the target. We know that clear expectations is very, very useful for students. Well, absolutely the same thing is true for adults. And I cannot count the number of times where I go onto a campus, and here's what I have people do. In a little meeting, I'll say, okay, everybody, I just want you to write down all the initiatives that you are currently required to be putting in place in your classroom. Go. And sometimes people just look at me like, lady, there's not enough time for me to write everything down. And some people are writing down things that actually they're not even required to put into practice anymore. But no one came in and said, we need to be doing this and we're getting rid of this, or we're putting this into practice in order to shore up this particular expectation. We're very unclear about what we want our expectations to look and sound like. Now, I'm going to make this very specific to classroom management because really, even though we're setting up a climate for coaching, the title is classroom management in particular. So what we recommend is that you first create 5 specific targets. So let me walk you through this for just a second. Many of you have seen the basic 5, and I'm going to flip back and forth between these two. I know that's very, very small. That's why the PDF will be really useful. This actually comes out of Coaching Classroom Management book, Chapter 5, and it talks about basic 5 behavior benchmarks, and it goes through those 5 benchmarks. We work you through how to measure them, et cetera. So on this slide, it walks you through what those 5 benchmarks are. You've got the ratio of positive interactions, opportunities for students to respond or actively engage in classroom instruction, disruptions, which are anything that gets the teacher or another student off task, actual time on task or academic engagement, and then alignment with expectations, which would be compliance. So we look at both engagement and compliance, and we look at those as 2 very separate things. Now, ideally, what would happen at the beginning of the year is as the administrator or the accountability, the strongest accountability person, would stand up in front of the staff and say, these are my expectations for your classroom. And you might use the actual benchmarks we laid out. So you might say, when I walk into your classroom, I expect to see a minimum of 91% of your students academically engaged in the moment. I might expect to see a minimum of 91% of students in compliance with your posted expectations. Now, let me tell you why you want to give a measurable percentage. Here's why. If you simply make the target one of intent versus effect, it's going to be very difficult to up the quality of implementation. Let me give you a specific example. You might be implementing CHAMPS classroom management, and maybe you've required that all teachers post their expectations for classroom activities and transitions. And there are many reasons why you would require that. It's a great idea. We highly recommend it. But hanging up a poster does not measure the quality or the number of children who are complying with those posted expectations. In fact, just requiring that you hang up a poster would be the same thing as me telling the math teachers, just hang up a multiplication poster. I'm not going to be assessing whether or not the kids understand the multiplication table at the end of the year. What we want to do is move from intent, hanging up the poster, to effect, a 91% compliance rate. So the more pieces or the more expectations that you have that illustrate effect, the stronger implementation will be. So if you want to have a measure of accountability, you have to give me a measurable goal, because just asking me to hang up a poster is not going to give any indication of the quality of my implementation. So at the very beginning of the year, let's say you stand up and you give me all these effect expectations. So I need to see a 3-to-1 ratio of positive interactions when I'm in your room. I need to see 91% of kids on task. I need to see 91% of kids in compliance with your expectations. Now, the beautiful thing about this is I can walk into a classroom as an administrator, and the whole class can be involved in cooperative group work. And maybe there's a lot of movement going on, and there's a lot of student-to-student interaction, and there's a lot of teacher-to-student interaction, and there's the noise level is a little bit higher than I'm used to, and that's making me a little nervous as an administrator. Without those benchmarks, I might inadvertently hold the teacher accountable to my style rather than the clear benchmarks. But if I have a target like that, I can walk into a classroom that may not be my style, and they could still be hitting every one of my benchmarks. And the beautiful thing is I can walk next door, and maybe this teacher's colleague has all the children sitting in rows, and it's very little student-to-student interaction, and there's no movement permitted at the time. But he or she, too, can be hitting the benchmarks. In other words, you can have two completely different classrooms. Holding teachers accountable doesn't mean eliminating autonomy. So now we've got two completely different classrooms. Both teachers are being held to a consistent benchmark, but they're both being allowed to autonomously run their classroom the way their personality dictates, perhaps what they teach, the time of day, the needs of their kids. All of those things would require a certain level of autonomy. So I want you to take just a moment and think about this. Do you currently, and maybe even in regards to the initiative that you thought about earlier with the Cornerstones, or in regards to classroom management, do you have a clear target that all teachers are aware of and that requires consistency while allowing for autonomy? So a target that requires consistency and allows for autonomy. So take a moment to think about that. Because now I'm going to further illustrate why we want to get away from kind of rote consistency, meaning that everyone looks the same. And bear with me for a moment on this story, and hopefully you can all see this slide, and I hope it looks exactly like what the slide shows, and that is a s'more. So if you're getting a little hungry, maybe you're getting ready for lunch, just had lunch, really a s'more is good in either one of those situations. But a few years ago, my stepson, when he was still living at home, he's grown and out of the house now, but he went on this little fetish where he just wanted s'mores all the time. He wanted to put the microwave in the, or wanted to put the marshmallow in the microwave and blow it all up and make it all hot, put it together. And I wanted to be a good parent and yet also wanted to allow him to have some autonomy and freedom. I thought I structured this personally. I mean, man, I slapped on my safe and civil badge and I said, let's structure this for his success. And we would go to Walmart on the weekends and we would buy a long sleeve of those Hershey's candy bars. And in those long sleeves of miniature Hershey candy bars, there's like 10 candy bars. And the rule was he could divide them up as he saw fit through the week, but once the chocolate was gone, it was gone. So if he wanted to have 2 s'mores every day with 1 piece of chocolate, he could do that. If he wanted to double it up and have 2 per day, that was absolutely fine. But once they were gone, they were gone. I was in the middle of a training down in Texas, and I get this picture sent to my phone, and all the text says is, ha, ha, ha. And I don't know if you can tell based on the shadow what he had found in the cupboard, but he had found the chocolate chips. Now, we had assumed he knew that when we said the chocolate was gone, you're done, and that we assumed he knew that meant our chocolate that we had envisioned. But if you think about it, there are 4 key ingredients you need to make a s'more. You need marshmallow, graham cracker, chocolate, and heat. And he'd found all 4. And in fact, in this picture, the reason why the shadows are so long is he decided to set it in the sun and let it melt instead of putting it in the microwave. I don't know how this child didn't pass science, but that's what he decided to do. So he had all 4 ingredients. Now, 2 of them were different how I had envisioned they would be put into practice, but the s'more was still a s'more. So when you sit down as coaches, as the Cornerstones, and you start thinking about what is our target, what are we asking teachers to do, your next conversation needs to be, what are we requiring that they do that is exactly how we envisioned, and what will we allow them to do that is up to their discretion? For instance, if you require a CHAMPS visual, are there some specific guidelines that you want everyone on your campus to follow? Is anything up for grabs? Do they all need to look identical? What is it that you want it to look like? Because if you're not clear on what you want, you might end up with a s'more that looks nothing like you envisioned in front of you. And in that second, especially as the evaluator, you're going to have to make a call on whether that is okay or not. And the more things that you have to make a call on a case-by-case basis, the less time you have to devote to helping coach the teachers who truly need it. So take just a moment and think about, first of all, do you have a clear target, which is what I asked you before, that creates a consistent benchmark while allowing for autonomy? And do teachers know specifically what parts in which they are allowed to be autonomous? Take a moment to think about that. Once you've created your 4 cornerstones, you've got everybody in the right place, people know what they're supposed to be doing as an evaluator and a non-evaluator, you've created a target for your current initiative, you've communicated to teachers clearly what parts are non-negotiable and what parts in which they're allowed to be autonomous, now you have to set up a system of formative accountability on your campus. And what that means is, even as an evaluator, you're not doing full-scale evaluation every time you walk onto a campus. Now, I truly believe in this Jim Collins quote that, of course, comes from the book Good to Great, that if you want to get anywhere, you have to have 2 things going for you. The first is the unwavering belief or faith that you can hit your goal. So whatever the target is that you've just created, you have to have the unwavering belief that you can get your campus to hit it. But you also have to have the willingness to see how far from that goal you are, which means we have got to create a system of efficient and effective formative accountability. So I'm going to talk about doing formative accountability from an evaluator standpoint and a non-evaluator standpoint for just a moment. So the first one is going to be, of course, the evaluative standpoint. So most likely this is going to be your principal, and I know we have some principals on here. So principals, what are your primary responsibilities when you're walking through? Well, let's talk about this. We know that student behavior is simply more responsible and motivated when adults are actively observing. This is why when people ask me what's the quickest, easiest thing you can do to decrease the level of misbehavior in your schools, I say immediately you need to increase your quality and level of supervision. We know that that works. Well, the same is absolutely true for staff. Now, if you don't believe me, I want you to think about this for a moment. And if you're with people especially, you can answer out loud. But I want you to assume you are behind the wheel of a car, you're by yourself, and you are driving along and you see this speed limit sign. How fast are you going when you see this speed limit sign? You're driving down, nice day, looks sunny, no inclement weather. How fast are you going? Take just a moment. I will not share with you how fast I'm going because I don't want this to be used against me in a court of law, but I am most likely not going 65 miles per hour. Now, I want you to just acknowledge, you don't have to say what your speed would change to, but I just want you to acknowledge whether or not your behavior would change if you saw this. Now, for most of us, our behavior would change. Even those of you who've never received a speeding ticket, and I have received one speeding ticket in my entire life when I was all of 19 years old. But I still understand that there's a hierarchy, and I also understand that the police are there primarily to remind us to follow the laws, just like we as adult supervisors are really there to remind kids to do what they're supposed to be doing. So if we've recently had a training, and it has been about increasing our ratio of positive interactions, and my principal comes in to simply stand there for 5 minutes, that's a reminder to me, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be really upping my ratio of positive interactions with my kiddos. And this is based on the belief that many of us respond to a certain level of authority. Now, this doesn't mean this is all we respond to. In fact, some of you might say, I see a police officer and I just speed right by. They can try to catch me if they can. Well, in that case, there might be something else or something additional that would certainly make a difference. I want you to imagine for a moment you're still behind the wheel of a car. You're on a 65-mile-per-hour road, but sitting in the passenger seat with you is someone you really like and respect. Maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your own child, maybe it's just a friend you've had, maybe it's a clergyman, it's somebody that has meaning in your life. And maybe this person has even lost someone due to a speeding incident or a horrific car crash. Most likely, your behavior would also change, whether you were trying to impress someone or simply because you were empathetic to their needs, and that's the whole respect issue. So when we are providing formative accountability, we want to come at this twofold. Yes, there is a measure of authority, and many people will respond to that, but when they only respond to authority, they probably do exactly what we do when we see a police officer. We do exactly what we're supposed to be doing right up until the moment that the authority is no longer in our rearview mirror. You want staff to change because, yes, people in an authoritarian or an accountability position are coming in and checking on me because they want what's best for our school and they have very high expectations. But at the same time, we are building relationships in a certain level of respect. So we don't want to come at this with only one aspect. So if we've been trying to change things just based on authority or accountability, that has probably blown up in our faces a little bit. But also, we can't just change things through respect. That's also not as long-lasting. There has to be a mixture of both. That's that support and accountability twofold approach. Now, what we recommend administrators is that you actually create a system of walkthroughs. Now, I'm going to show you a blank calendar and then a completed calendar. And this is upside down. But I think you get the gist. You have all the teachers' names, and you simply write down when you've gone in to see them. I know this is very small. You don't have to see what's in the little boxes. But what happens is I have 4 or 5 weeks on my calendar here. I've got all my teachers running down the left-hand side of your screen. And then I have the dates up above, and I simply write down the times that I went in to see them. Now, this was actually, this whole idea of really kind of recording these walkthrough visits initially was brought to my attention when I was an instructional coach in Topeka, and every person on an administrative contract was required to do about 40 walkthroughs per week. 40 walkthroughs per week. Now, that's a lot. Here's what I recommend administrators do. You sit down for a week and you try to do as many 5-minute walkthroughs as you possibly can, and you figure out what can I do comfortably and still get my job done. Now, keep in mind, some of you, it might be in a catch-22, because the more you're actually out in classrooms, eventually the fewer behavioral issues you will start to see in your office. But initially, I know some of you who are maybe in buildings with lots of behavioral issues at the moment, it might be difficult to do the walkthroughs because then you have a queue of kids lined up. So you might have to figure out what does that schedule then look like. Who deals with students who go into that waiting queue while I am out doing walkthroughs. Because what we found is when you do walkthroughs, adult behavior changes. Again, not because it only changes for the moment, but because adults are reminded, oh yeah, this counts. Now, here's what I recommend you do. When you do a 5-minute walkthrough, you are recording whatever data corresponds with the target you set. So maybe you even let teachers know, teachers, I'm going to be walking in and I'm doing 5-minute walkthroughs all week. If you see me pop in, I'm looking for 2 very specific things: ratio of positive interactions and compliance with posted expectations. 2 really great things to look for this time of year and at the beginning of the school year especially. Let's say you walk into Amy Adams' classroom and the compliance is supposed to be at 91% and she's at about 50%. So what you do is you make a little note in your walkthrough form that you, and I would probably color code it, so I might highlight Amy Adams, I need to get back in her classroom really quickly. So I go in again on Tuesday at around the same time and she's still really low, about 50% compliance. So again, that's 2 strikes now. It's worrying me because I want to make sure that we keep Amy around and that I really hone her skills. So I go in a 3rd time and she's at about 60% compliance. So it averages out in the 50-60 range, and that's not going to work because what happens is that tells me when it gets to our formal evaluation, she's going to struggle. So I might have a conversation with Amy where I say, Amy, look, here's the thing. We set a bar at the beginning of the year that I need to see 90% compliance with your posted expectations. And when I've done my 5-minute walkthroughs, the kids have been hovering around 50 to 60%. Now, it could be a lot of different things. Maybe your expectations don't quite match what you want. You want to make some changes, and that would be absolutely fine as long as kids are still engaged in learning, et cetera. But I need you to improve this. Now, there are several different ways that I can have you do this. The first is I can give you some great books on classroom management to check out and read from my personal library and put some of those things into practice. If that doesn't appeal to you, there's a training coming up at the district office in a couple of weeks, and I'd love to help you find a sub and get set up for that if that would be more to your liking. Or we've got a great coach, Jackie, who's in the building, and Jackie could come into your classroom and she could work with you. Now, you should know I'm not going to ask Jackie what your conversations entail, and I'm not going to ask Jackie whether or not you've improved. But I'm going to come in 2 weeks, and I need to see at least a 20% improvement in compliance when I do my next walkthrough. So however you decide to approach this issue is absolutely up to you as a professional, but it absolutely does need to get changed. Now, do you see how I still have the bar? That is non-negotiable. But how she chooses, in this case Amy Adams, our fictional teacher, how she chooses to improve is up to her as a professional. Now, it would be great if she picked a coach. I mean, we paid Jackie a large sum of money to work with her. And most likely, and what we've found in all our studies in Topeka, is if coaches have done a good job of building relationships, and I'm going to show you an example of how to do that, then they will choose to work with the coach. But at the end of the day, I just need to let her know, this is the target. You're not hitting it. How you choose to fix it is up to you, and here are all your options. That's the formative accountability piece. Now, let's say the person does choose in particular to work with a coach, right? And I said instructional coach here, but you could just as easily be called an instructional interventionist, a behavior coach, or whatever your title decrees. In that case, they go into a little more detail. And again, this will be on the PDF, but I just wanted you to be aware of what it was without going into a lot of explanation. Instead of doing 5-minute walkthroughs, they're going to do 15 to 20-minute walkthroughs where they explore the exact same benchmarks that we have set up at the beginning of the year. So what happens next is, with this accountability, whether they are working with me, the evaluative coach, in a formative setting, or whether they are working with the non-evaluative in a formative setting, we're going to sit down and set goals and plan interventions. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to show the teacher where they're at in relation to the goal. Now, I said it's always best, or I said to just say, here's where you're at. But I think if you can visually show people a representation of their data, that's even better. Now, I will also admit this. We're not good at believing data that's put in front of us. Like, we will come up with 10 million reasons why that data can't possibly be accurate. This is why we're really moving towards, yes, take the data, but if you can get teachers to videotape during that same time frame, so maybe that same 15 to 20-minute time frame, and take data on themselves, the conversation is so much richer. What we've found is when teachers videotape themselves and they can actually see what's happening and take their own data, there's a much greater willingness to set a goal and plan an intervention. So what the coach is going to do, whether they are evaluative or non-evaluative, but during this formative segment, they're going to brainstorm possible options. So what might the teacher try? How could the teacher address each benchmark? What are some appropriate interventions for each of the 5 stoic variables? Because what you want to do is get away from this. So top-down feedback, all right? Top-down feedback used to be that the coach, many times the evaluator, would simply come in and say, your kids aren't in compliance. You need to fix that. Here's how you fix it, and I expect to see an improvement. We want to go more into the partnership feedback, or the C.E.D. And the C.E.D. is actually the collaborative exploration of data, and this is through Wendy Ranke, who's a co-author of the Coaching Classroom Management book. So as opposed to me simply sitting down and telling the teacher, listen, I've taken your data, here's what's wrong, here's what we need to put into practice. I actually sit down and I will triangulate myself in this exact position. So the teacher and the coach will be sitting beside each other, the data is in front of us, and I always start with a question. And the question I typically start with is, what do you think? Now, I've actually gotten a little more sophisticated in my level of questions. Sometimes before I even show the data, I'll say, based on what I just saw, and on what I took data, or based on the video of the data that you took and watched yourself, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best lesson that you ever taught, everything went well, and 1 being the worst, where would you have ranked this one? And if they say a 6, I say, great. What would have made it a 7? And typically people will really start to brainstorm what their own interventions might be. And if we can use that STOIC framework, which many of you know and love, all the better. So now we're pulling interventions that the teachers have identified based on this dialogue. So here's something else that has typically brought coaching to its knees in many areas. Many times a district or a school is given lots and lots of money. Here, you need to fix your math scores. We're giving you lots and lots of money for a couple years to hire a math coach. And you look around and you go, you know what? We're going to hire a great math coach. Jenny is the best math teacher we know. We're going to hire Jenny with the idea that Jenny simply walks around and creates lots of little Jennies. In fact, Jenny, we want you to just walk around and lay hands on all the other math coaches and create a miracle of epic proportions and just make everybody teach like you teach. But that takes away the autonomy we've been trying so hard to build in this climate of coaching. So to bring the autonomy back, you have to have your coaches deeply, deeply understand this aspect of partnership feedback. And the way they do that is through the partnership principles. And this is really what we're going to wrap our webinar up on here, is the partnership principles are simply a set of principles that guide your interactions with staff. So whether you are evaluative or non-evaluative, all of the coaches in a building should be really striving to hit these principles. Now, just because you have principles doesn't mean they're never violated. It simply gives you a stick by which to measure. So let me explain why having principles rather than just content knowledge on how to coach is vital. I'm going to tell you a little story about Ben and Emily. Okay, Ben and Emily, I want you to imagine they're driving in a car. And Ben is in the passenger seat, Emily is driving, and they get to a stoplight. And the light is red, and Emily pushes on the gas, and she blows right through it. And Ben goes, Emily, what are you doing? The light was red. Are you crazy? She goes, don't worry about it. My brother does it all the time. Well, that doesn't make Ben feel any better, but he's known Emily a long time, so he trusts her to some extent. They get to the next light. The light is red. Emily pushes on the gas. She blows right through it. Ben goes, Emily, are you crazy? You're going to get us killed. That light was red. What are you doing? She says, don't worry about it. My brother does it all the time. Well, now Ben's getting really nervous. So they get to the next light. The light is red. Emily pushes on the gas. She blows right through it. Ben goes, Emily, are you crazy? What are you doing? You are going to get us killed. That light was red. She said, Ben, calm down. My brother does it all the time. Well, now Ben is really nervous. They get to the next light, and right as they approach, it turns green. And Ben breathes a huge sigh of relief, and they get right up to it, and Emily pushes on the brakes and comes to a screeching halt. And Ben looks at her and says, "Emily, what are you doing? The light is green. Are you crazy? You can go." And she said, "Are you kidding? My brother could be coming through here any minute." Now, here's the point of that story. Emily understands how to drive the car. She knows where the gas is located. She knows where the brake is located. She knows how to turn on the key. She knows how to make it go. But the principles under which she's operating the car are faulty, and eventually it's going to lead to catastrophe. Well, the same is sometimes true for our coaches. They understand the content. They understand the target. They understand maybe even the instructional tactics that could be useful in pushing people towards that target. But if the principles under which they're working with people on your campus are faulty, eventually it's going to lead to catastrophe. So we've outlined in Coaching Classroom Management 7 basic partnership principles to help guide every interaction with staff, with the idea being, and I know, again, this is very hard to see, but that occasionally coaches reflect on whether or not they really fulfill these 7 principles. So as an example, under equality, do I really acknowledge teachers whose opinions are different than mine on a scale of 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree? If you have coaches who would also like to be coached, what I recommend is you use an alternate form of this, which we talk about in our larger coaching sessions, where the teachers that they work with actually evaluate them based on these principles. So instead of the first question reading, do I really acknowledge teachers whose opinions are different than mine, it might say, does my coach really acknowledge my opinion when it's different from his or hers? Then they take that information and use it as a platform for their own coaching. We have covered a lot of ground in this particular hour. There were 3 very broad session objectives that I had that I wanted to give you just a few key components to think about. The first was just really differentiating and defining the role of both an evaluative and a non-evaluative coach, that there are many, many similarities, but that you want to protect each other, especially your non-evaluators, from being seen in an evaluative capacity. The next thing we looked at is thinking about whether or not your target is clear. Did it build consistency between classrooms while still allowing for autonomy? And then the last one was, how do we build a system of formative accountability where whether we are an evaluator or non-evaluator, we can look at classrooms quickly and easily and get people plugged into the resources they need in order to improve. So that's really been our overview of coaching, or what I like to call our infomercial on coaching. For some additional information, you can always visit our Safe and Civil Schools website and our Pacific Northwest Publishing website. Cover of the Coaching Classroom book is illustrated right there. All the ideas I brought to you today, with the exception of the 4 cornerstones, are brought to you more in depth within the pages of the Coaching Classroom Management. This will be available as a link and a PDF. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jackie Hefner to wrap up our hour. Jackie, to you.
Terrific, Tricia. Thanks for taking the time with us. I don't think there's really any lingering questions. There were a couple of questions about confirming what you were referencing, and other folks did a great job of answering those questions for other attendees. It looks like there might have been a couple questions that might have gone directly to you that I did not get CC'd on, so you might just take a quick skim on your Q&A tab and make sure there's any broad-based content questions. This is a great time, folks. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Tricia, you can enter them in the Q&A box, and we'll have a couple minutes here with her before we wrap up.
So I've got one coming through. Are the clear targets set by schools within the districts, or are they set by the district for the schools? This is, first of all, a wonderful question, and I wish we had about another hour to devote to it, because what I actually recommend is that the district sets targets that they then allow the schools to autonomously hit, meaning now all the schools have specific targets, and then each campus may need different smaller targets in order to hit the district goals. So I do recommend that it's a top-down and that every target we have on our campus will get us to that district goal. But if your district doesn't have goals, it doesn't mean your school is confined. You can certainly set up your own. And the reason why I believe, and this is something that, of course, Jim Knight talks about in all his work, especially his work Unmistakable Impact, where every school should have a one-page target that is like a 3 to 5 year focus plan. And you can use this target for so many things. Hiring new teachers, you put this target in front of them and say, I want you to look over this target. Tell me how your skill set can help our school reach these goals. Another thing you can do is when teachers come up to you and say, hey, I really want to go on this conference in Maui, will you send me? Before you say yes, you say, yes, could you look at our school target? How will attending the conference help you hit these target goals? So there are a lot of things that you can do there. One-page target, having the district set the target first, allowing autonomy building to building. But if you're a building on your own without clear district goals, you can, of course, set up your own. And I think that's the only question that came through, Jackie.
Yeah, I don't see any other ones here.
Okay, I think we did this perfectly as far as timing goes, everyone. Thank you so much for giving the time up to us. And Jackie, any last words?
I just want to make note that if you found this information valuable, you'll be able to access the recording in a day or two's time. We will send a link out directing you to the archived webinars page on our site, where you'll be able to access the recording for this and several of our previous webinars. Please feel free, if there's folks in your school or district that you think should have this information, to share that with them. If you have any questions that pop up after the webinar, you're certainly happy to respond to the email with a link and ask them, and we will work on getting answers. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today.